Hi, I'm Hisham bin Atiyah. This is another episode of TikTok. Today I'm chatting with Sipke Schoorstra. How are you, sir?
Hi, Hisham. Great, thanks.
Okay, when it comes to workflow, Sipka comes to my mind. Sipka is a well-known guy in the Orchard community for his contribution in the workflows module. But over the last few years, I have seen watching a massive activities for his amazing work on Elsa workflows, which is prove his commitment to that project. With that, would you like to introduce yourself, Sipka?
Of course, my name is Sipke Schoorstra. I'm a software developer by trade. I started all the way back in 2000 as a junior web developer, where I made my did my experience with ASP.NET, ASP as it was called back then. I think it was around 2003 where I started a small company with a friend of mine, and where we did a lot of consulting. And as part of that consulting, we created a CMS that was tailor made for our customers. So it was not like a reusable uh, CMS system. It was copy paste all the way, and that was great. We made for our time a lot of money. Uh, you have to imagine we were young guys, so that this was a lot of fun.
Yep.
Ultimately, it became really hard to maintain all these copies of CMSs for our customers. From time to time, they would come back with requests, and it was really impossible to maintain. So we created a new system. We called it O3. So that was my attempt to create a CMS framework or a platform that could be reused without copy pasting. But that too was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun too. But
Yep.
I realized I should be using something more like WordPress, but I
Yep.
never really liked PHP.
Yep.
But I did learn a lot about MVC. That was the new thing back in the days, and so I started to look for an MVC based content management system. So I started googling, and then I discovered Orchard. And that was a dream for me because that was exactly what I was looking for. It was modular, using MVC. And so I started to deep dive into that. And that's how I became, I think, more or less around 2011. That's when I started blogging about my learnings. And that was a lot of fun. And that also essentially spearheaded my or kickstarted my career as as an Orchard consultant, as a freelancer. And so many years after that, I did a lot of consulting on Orchard Core, not Orchard Core back then. That was still Orchard.
Yep.
Gained a lot of experience, and yeah, and then it was around 2016. I was hired by an organization to help them work on a platform that initially started out to be based on Orchard. That's how they reached out to me. But ultimately, it was decided that Orchard may not have been the best fit. So we replaced that with something built from the ground up using Service Fabric, I believe. But still, we needed a workflow engine. And as you know, Hisham, Orchard comes with a very powerful. It's simple but powerful workflow module, and that's still what we needed. But uh, obviously, not running on Orchard, you cannot just use the modules as you want when working on a non-Orchard project. So
Yep. Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
so
That
we
that's
looked for other options out there.
Yes, that's great. You did a great job on the workflows in both ILSA and Orchard Core workflows module. I really appreciate all the efforts that you made to the community, Sipka. So, for the listener who may not know what ILSA workflows is.
Sure. So Elsa Workflows, in a nutshell, is a set of .NET packages, NuGet packages that you can use in your own ASP.NET Core project to essentially turn it into a workflow engine. And so if you're familiar with Orchard, this concept should be familiar because what it allows to do is with Orchard, it turns it into a CMS. And then you can add custom modules and you can implement custom application specific behaviors and features. Now, not everyone is using Orchard Core, but still, if you are creating a ASP.NET Core project with your domain-specific functionalities and services and events, if you wanted to implement long-running processes or even short-running processes, or just logic that maybe you want to be able to change quickly without having to recompile or even redeploy your application, a workflow engine or a business rules engine could make a lot of sense. And Elsa allows you to do exactly that. So you can hook in those packages into your application, and now it becomes capable of executing workflows. And this then empowers the users of your system, or even if they are technical users, to declare processes using either a custom DSL or using JSON, or even using Elsa Studio, which is a visual designer, to visually create a workflow, and they can then be executed by your application. And that's actually very powerful, because your own application has this usually rich domain model with application-specific events. And now you could expose those events to the workflow engine, allowing users of your application to handle those events using visual workflows.
That's cool. That's cool. What's inspired the creation of Elsa? Is there any gap for the existing solution?
Yeah, so I briefly touched upon that when I was mentioning the project I worked on in 2016. There was a big gap, because what we were looking for was a workflows engine that was MIT compatible.
Yeah.
So not commercially licensed, because that would not work for what their plans were with their
Yeah.
platform. So it had to be MIT, ideally open source, and ideally .NET based, because we were a .NET shop, and having a visual designer that was easy to use. And so we were looking for a solution that ticked all these boxes, but we couldn't find anything, and that always stuck with me. And I actually had experience with Windows Workflow Foundation all the way back in
Yeah.
2006 and later in
Yes.
2010. Yeah, you are familiar with Windows
Y-
Workflow Foundation?
Yeah, yeah, but I didn't. That I heard about it, but I didn't go deep dive it.
Yes, I really dove deep into it, but I played around with it, and I always found it so mesmerizing, really, to have this workflow engine that's capable of executing these building blocks called activities. For developers, it's fun to be building those blocks, and then it's easy for users to link them together as if they were little Lego blocks. It's just very creative and fun. And as an engineering mind, you want to understand how these things work. And I always had this curiosity. And now in 2016, we were looking for something. We couldn't find anything. We ended up, by the way, using Windows Workflow Foundation. It wasn't a big success. And I think ultimately they abandoned it because it was too complicated and too hard to maintain. But so, and I just had this thought that didn't let go of me, of what if we could just use Orchard Core or Orchard workflows as a standalone or reusable package. That would have been so great. So that thought never left me. And then I ultimately started to tinker a little bit with it and do some experiments. And that ultimately turned into Elsa 1. So that's actually why I created Elsa, because indeed it was actually filling a gap.
Interested, interested. You mentioned some of the key building blocks like activities, workflows, and trigger. For those who new to the workflows, what are they and how they interact with each other?
Sure. So think of a workflow engine as a computer, a CPU that can execute programs. And in this analogy, the workflow engine is the CPU, and the program would be a workflow. And a workflow consists of a series of statements or steps. So an activity is the unit representing such a step, like a statement in C sharp. And statements, of course, they could be simple variable assignments, but they could also be function calls. And that is very similar when we talk about activities. They are created by developers, and think of an activity as a class that has an execute method. And within that execute method, you can do whatever you need to be done in that execute method. And so now the user, they drag and drop those activities onto the designer, connect them together visually, and that's how you then model your process step by step. And so the activity, that's the smallest unit. The workflow engine essentially executes a queue of scheduled activities, and it continues doing so until there's no more work to be done. And that either causes the workflow execution to finish, or if there are still activities that haven't marked themselves as completed, the workflow becomes suspended or paused. The term we use is suspended. That's the activities part. The triggers, they are activities as well, but they are a special kind of activities because the workflow engine knows about triggers and what it will do whenever you publish a workflow definition or activate it. The workflow engine, or the tooling around that, rather, it looks at the metadata provided by these triggers and then actually creates trigger records in the database. And that's then used by surrounding infrastructure in the application to execute workflows starting with those triggers. And I'll give you an example to make that a little bit more concrete. Let's say we have the timer trigger. So imagine an activity called timer. You add it to your workflow. This is the starting activity of the workflow. And when you publish that workflow, it will create a quartz trigger, which uses the same terminology. So there's a quartz trigger, and that is bound to this workflow. So anytime the quartz job fires based on that trigger, it will execute that workflow. And this is a very extensible system. So we have all kinds of triggers. I just mentioned timer. There could be general purpose events. It could be HTTP endpoints. So there, Elsa comes with a broad set of triggers out of the box, and it's extensible. So you can also create custom triggers. And that's really where Elsa shines when you integrate it into your own application. Because as I mentioned earlier, within your application, you have domain-specific events, and they can then be modeled as triggers. And that makes for a beautiful integration where workflows execute automatically as your application publishes events.
That's great. That's great. I searched in the docs and I saw that the Elsa workflows is built on a powerful modular and plugin architecture, which is make it easy to extend the framework with custom functionality. Can you tell us about the extensibility points, Elsa?
Absolutely. So one extensibility endpoint, of course, is the ability to create your own activities. That is key. Also, it exposes all sorts of services. For example, there are services for persistence. So persistence is abstracted away. You can plug in your own persistence provider if you wanted to. Even the runtime is abstracted away, so you can provide your own runtime. Out of the box, there's the distributed workflow runtime, which works great when you host in a clustered environment for horizontal scaling. This is a must. But it uses distributed locking, which is easy to use, but it also it's not as efficient as, for example, using the actor model, which is a different distributed computing model. But there's also an implementation for that if you prefer using the actor model and extend upon that. And then, of course, there's the ability to implement your own runtime. For example, maybe you want to be using Orleans as the distributed hosting model. For that, you can implement your own implementation. So those are just a few extensibility endpoints. They're more like variable types, or let's say you have your own domain models and you want to see them in the variable picker in the designer. That is easily extended with your custom types. There are dynamic expressions. Out of the box, there is JavaScript support, Liquid support, Python, C#, and then you can add your own. Maybe you do like PHP. You can add it in if you like. And then these expressions themselves, they can be enhanced with more functions, like the JavaScript implementation uses Gint, like Orchard Core also uses Gint. That feature itself is also extensible with custom functions. So essentially anything and everything in Elsa is extensible.
That's great. That's great. And for those who want to use the Elsa in the production environment, how does Elsa handle the persistence, state management, and the scalability?
Sure. So the way this works is, so let's talk about persistence. So I already mentioned Elsa is designed in multiple layers, multiple tiers. So there's the core tier that doesn't have any notion of persistence. It can just execute activities, and it returns as a result of the function call to execute an activity the workflow state. Now it's out that it just that layer wouldn't be enough for persistence. It would be up to the hosting application to take care of that. Obviously, this is a common concern. So there's a second layer, which is called the runtime layer. The layer introduces that can take the workflow state and store it in whatever instance store is installed. So, for example, using EF Core allows you to store it in SQL Server or Postgres. There's a MongoDB implementation, which obviously allows you to store it in, or the system to store it in MongoDB. So that's the persistence story in a nutshell. About scalability, I mentioned the runtime. So
Yeah.
what is a must-have is to install the distributed workflow runtime, and this allows you to just deploy your ASP.NET Core application, for example, to Kubernetes, and then it automatically. Well, I shouldn't say automatically. There are some services that you do need to make sure are used in your application. One is the distributed runtime. When you use timers, you'll want to use either the Quartz.net provider or the Hangfire provider because they are inherently multi-cluster or cluster friendly out of the box. And then if you also want to be able to use Elsa Studio to manage workflows that are running in a clustered environment, you also need to have CAS synchronization. So you'll need some sort of service bus mechanism or Redis, or if you use Protoactor as the runtime, then that is automatically built in. So it really depends on what features you use, which other features you need to enable. But this all comes out of the box. You just need to be aware of those features so that you enable them in your application. For example, for local CAS synchronization. That's what Elsa is using in production in a clustered environment. Those are the main things to keep in mind when running in production.
You mentioned Elsa Studio, which is, I think, the UI designer for Elsa workflows. So, how does the Elsa, with such tool, empower the non-developer to design the workflows without write coding?
So the point of Elsa Studio is exactly for users that are not technical or maybe a little bit technical, who are relatively comfortable writing expressions. So it's not aimed at completely non-technical users, but maybe business developers or business process managers. So it helps those users because it provides more than just the designer. It allows you to create workflow definitions and then indeed design them, but then also create more workflow definitions and then also even manage the workflow instances. So when a workflow definition is executed, it creates a workflow instance. So you can manage and apply those and troubleshoot and debug them. The Studio is a extensible modular application similar to Orchard Core in the sense that you can create your own module that installs its own menu into the UI, and then of course that links to your own custom pages. For a good example of this, the agents module, which allows the user to define agents from Elsa Studio and manage them, and they then become activities. But the Studio essentially makes it easy for users to manage the system without having to do that directly in the database or writing your own dashboard UI.
Are there any debugging or monitoring support for the Elsa Studio, or is not yet?
So there's limited support in the following form. I mentioned workflow instances, so you can see a list of workflow instances, which gives you visibility in terms of are there any faults? Are there any workflow instances completed or maybe not completed while you expected them to be completed? You can then open them and then see the entire workflow journal. So you can see the steps that were taken. You can see stack traces in case an activity faulted for some unexpected reason. So a lot of those things are captured and then made visible, which is very powerful and necessary when you deal with processes, that, especially when they're long running, but also short running. It's just a great way to make those things visible. But more work has to be done in that area. For example, we're currently working on the ability to select a individual activity that has executed, and maybe you want to see its call stack. So the workflow journal helps a little bit, but it doesn't convey the exact path that led to a given activity's execution. The more complicated your workflows, the higher the need is for being able to see the call stack of an activity. So that's what we're working on currently. In production, what you really want to do is have some sort of external visibility platform like Datadog, because that gives you a lot of telemetry that you will need to troubleshoot in case of issues, because the issues could happen anywhere in the database, in API calls that were made. And so, of course, Elsa Workflows, when it fails making some sort of call, it will log that, but that's also the extent of it. And it's not aimed for itself to be a holistic analytics platform. It's growing in that area by making it easier for users, and it's being richer in functionality, but it's not the core feature of it.
Many of the developers, including I, might thought that the Elsa is just a workflow engine plus a UI designer. But I heard there's a hidden gem known as Elsa Server. How this tool played a vital role in the Elsa ecosystem.
Right. So, so actually, Elsa, it is a workflow engine, or rather, it's a set of building blocks to create workflow engines. And so this allows you to turn your own workflow application into a workflow engine. But that also means you can create a standalone ASP.NET Core application that is just a workflow engine, an orchestrator that you can interface with through REST APIs. And so it's really up to you what you prefer in terms of architecture in your IT landscape. So Elsa Server is more of a term that represents the application that can serve or execute and serve workflow engines. That's what we mean when we say Elsa Server. That said, there's currently a recent repository that was created called Elsa Apps that is intended to be those general purpose workload or Elsa Server flavors, and there's a few of them, because you can have Elsa Server that's like a headless workflows engine. Then there's another project that is hosting the Elsa Server plus Elsa Studio as a single application or single deployable unit, and there will be Elsa Studio as its own deployable unit. So Elsa Server from that repository will be So just to finish that,
yep.
It is intended to be general purpose that you can configure, and so then using that you don't have to create your own workflow engine integrated into your own application, because maybe you just want some sort of orchestrator and interact with it through REST APIs and service buses. And I think the key takeaway is it's a tool set, so it's highly modular and pluggable, and you can create workflow engines yourself or use off-the-shelf workflow engines that we are currently working on.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the real-world use cases for Elsa. I heard that the Orta Core and ABB framework, they have an integration with Elsa. Could you talk a little bit how the integration or such integration becomes easy for them?
Absolutely. So both those projects that you mentioned, they are .NET applications or .NET framework, and Elsa being a .NET framework as well, in the form of a set of packages.
Yeah.
It's as easy as referencing those packages and then installing that into your DI using the adds Elsa extension method. And then you can, of course, it has a configuration API, so you can configure it to configure which persistence provider you want to use, which runtime you want to use, what other features you want to use, what activities to enable, what custom activities to enable. So super easy. If you're a .NET developer and you're used to installing other packages like Hangfire, Quartz, Orchard Core, then this is a very similar experience.
That's good. So for future and vision, what is on the roadmap of Elsa workflows?
Right. So there's a ton of stuff that is on the backlog, and so I try to group them into various buckets. So one bucket is the reliability, performance, and security bucket. Um, there I have a bucket for better user experience and diagnostics, uh, and then another one for actual features and connectors. So a lot of those things are on the backlog. Short term, focusing on stability, and one example of that is the graceful shutdown. So imagine you have an ASP.NET Core application, maybe running in Kubernetes, and now it returns a SIG term or something like that, some sort of signal to stop the application. Then there's a grace period of, I think, 30 seconds. I'm not sure, it could be different. But then the application has a little bit of time to clean up after itself, but ultimately it will just be shut off. And you can imagine as workflow instances are executing, maybe they're doing all sorts of expensive stuff or important stuff that ideally is not simply cut off. It would be better if the workflow engine can stop receiving new work and finish up existing work that's going on. And so this is what we call a graceful shutdown. That is being implemented to make the engine even more reliable than it is today. So that's one feature. Another feature that I'm really excited about is agents. So agents is a module from the Elsa extensions repository that gives users the ability to define their custom agents from the UI from Elsa Studio, and they represent cognitive tasks, right? So, for example, maybe you want some agent that can review some code, maybe write some code, or even write blog posts, review blog posts. Anything that humans would normally do, you can potentially rely on LMs. We all know this. But then being able to orchestrate that in a workflow engine allows you to create deterministic processes, because that's where workflow engines are super good at. And LMs, they are non-deterministic. So finding this right balance using Elsa, that is and workflow engines in general, that is super powerful. And this module exists today, but it's going to be evolved into making it easier to also try out these agents before you actually deploy them. That's one feature. Another feature is also related to AI, and that is having a co-pilot experience or an AI assistant experience in Elsa Studio, so that you can use your, the natural language interface that we are all used to when we talk with ChatGPT, where you, or developers using Rider and Visual Studio, where you have your co-pilot chat. You can just chat with the system, so you can ask questions about the workflow. You can ask it to fix workflows or create workflows from scratch, and you can even have an agent running, doing loops of work. So you can give it a task, and it's going to finish the task until it's done. And that could help you become more productive in terms of creating workflows, troubleshooting workflows, but also analyzing issues of the workflow instances, analyzing production data, really. So anything that you can do in the UI with Elsa Studio and in the engine, the Copilot will help you figure things out. That is going to be a very important feature that I'm thinking about working short term.
Very, very interesting. So, how do you see workflow engines evolving in the age of microservices, serverless, and AI driven automation?
Yeah, that's a big question. So it also really a little bit depends on your horizon, on your event horizon.
Yeah,
If it's beyond that, obviously I don't know.
yeah,
But from what I can see now is deterministic processes, they still matter.
yeah,
AIs, they can, of course, they could generate processes themselves,
exactly.
but it's still non-deterministic. And at some point, they will be able to generate whole else to execute processes that they come up with reliably and deterministically. But we are not there yet. Until then, workflow engines still matter. We
Yeah,
also need time to adjust and adapt. So combining the two, workflow engines and AI, that is super powerful. Uh, we all know about processes that involve interacting with humans and machines and
yeah,
services,
exactly.
and now those human steps, they will more and more be replaced with AI steps, but the process itself is still deterministic. So that's one part. The other part is, I already mentioned it, the co-pilot
Yeah,
experience. You
yeah,
can have agents uh, analyze processes, optimize them, provide suggestions. So it's going to make it more easy and more productive to manage and create and optimize workflows. So that's another area where AI will play a big role.
yeah,
And then the third one is, as I also mentioned, analyzing runtime data
exactly, exactly.
for troubleshooting and
Yeah,
understanding and insights.
yeah, yes. So finally, Ilsa Workflows is an incredibly valuable project for the community. But how easy is for the developer to get started with Ilsa or contribute to the project?
So I think it's very easy to get started. They're getting started guides, so most people are able to get up and running quickly. But the challenge is when you want to dive deeper and get into the more advanced
Yeah,
scenarios. For example, let's say you have heard about this ability to um, expose domain events to the workflow engine by
yeah,
creating triggers.
yeah.
Now, how do you create those triggers? So there's documentation, but the concepts are still a little bit advanced. And so what we need to do is we need to create more documentation, more in-depth documentation about various use cases. Many developers, they who are new to Elsa, they still struggle understanding. Okay, how do I do a document approval process? They know the process, but it's not very clear what does Elsa provide and what do they need to bring themselves. So there's still a lot of documentation and guidance that we need to provide there. So yeah, for starters, it's easy, but as you delve deeper, the learning curve steepens, but that will be solved by increasing documentation and guides and blog posts and those kinds of things. And also, of course, also as the ecosystem grows, there will be out of box modules like user task and ETL and maybe even samples of document approval systems where it becomes clear what do you need to bring yourself, what is already out.
We have been chatting with Sipke Schoorstra today in this episode of TikTok. See you again.